given the most remarkable, devoted service to the Queen, to my family, and to the country, and also to the whole of the Commonwealth.
The room did not erupt when the trustees spoke. It froze. King Charles sat at the long table, one hand resting near a sealed folder, as the words landed with unbearable weight. A royal codicil, hidden inside the late Queen's private instructions, had just been read aloud. It did not remove his crown. It did something more painful. It placed limits around his future reign. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles did not reach for the folder at first. He stared at it, as though the paper itself had crossed a line no living person dared to cross. Camilla sat close enough to see the change in him. The sudden stillness, the tightening around his mouth, the quiet collapse behind his eyes. William remained motionless across the table, and that calm wounded the king almost as deeply as the words themselves. Anne watched her brother carefully. Edward lowered his gaze. No one rushed to soften the silence, because everyone understood that silence had become part of the verdict. Charles knew the term mattered. A royal codicil means an added legal instruction attached to an existing royal document, and this one was tied to Queen Elizabeth's private succession papers, the confidential directions meant to guide what happened after her death. The trustees explained that certain future royal decisions could no longer rest with the king alone. Matters involving royal property, family appointments, symbolic inheritance, and historic privileges would require approval from a family trust council. That mattered because a monarch may wear the crown publicly, but the private machinery behind that crown decides who enters rooms, who receives honors, and who controls the legacy left behind. Camilla understood the wound before anyone said it aloud. This was not a cold legal adjustment. It felt like a message from the Queen to her son, delivered after death, saying love was not the same as trust. The Queen consort kept her hands folded, but her face betrayed the shock she was fighting to hide. Charles had spent a lifetime waiting to rule, waiting to prove that his judgment, his patience, and his vision had meaning. Now the mother he had served for decades appeared to have drawn a boundary around him before he ever had the chance to explain himself. The senior trustee opened the file again and confirmed the codicil had been signed after the Queen's final private review, making it impossible to dismiss as confusion, pressure, or clerical error. Charles finally touched the folder, then pulled his hand back, as if the seal still belonged to her. William's calm became impossible to ignore. The prince did not look surprised. He did not ask for the line to be repeated. He simply waited, and that waiting made the king turn toward him with a grief that had sharpened into suspicion. Anne broke the silence with one quiet question. Had the second page also been read? The trustee stopped. Edward looked up. Camilla's breath caught. Charles closed the folder without speaking, but the room had already changed again. Whatever pain the first page had caused, the second promised something even heavier. But before the second page could reshape the monarchy, the people around that table had to face what each of them stood to lose. No crown can protect a family from the moment private loyalty becomes public power. Charles sat wounded. Camilla sat guarded. William sat still, and Anne sat like someone who had expected the storm for years. Each person in that chamber carried a different fear. The codicil was not only changing procedure, it was exposing every hidden fracture beneath the royal surface. Charles had entered that room, believing his reign still belonged to him, in the deepest sense. Not the crown itself, not the ancient symbols, but the direction of it all. For years, he had carried ideas about what the monarchy should become, how it should modernize, who should stand closer, who should step back, and which doors should finally open under his command. Now the king felt that vision shrinking in front of his family. The paper had not taken his title. It had taken something more personal. It had taken the private confidence that his mother had left him full freedom to rule. William understood the weight of his own name before anyone else dared to say it. The prince was no longer only the heir waiting behind his father. Inside the codicil, He had become part of the living safeguard around the crown's future. That mattered, because the future king could now influence decisions once assumed to rest entirely with Charles, especially choices touching family legacy, estate access, and the symbolic order of the House of Windsor. His silence did not feel empty. It felt controlled. And to the monarch across from him, that control looked almost unbearable. Camilla felt the blow differently. She knew that a limit placed around Charles was also a limit placed around her. Every quiet conversation, every suggested appointment, every ceremonial preference, every request for access would now pass through a structure she could not command. The queen consort kept her expression steady, but behind that calm sat a harsher truth. Her success had always depended on proximity to the king's authority. If his private power was being narrowed, then her influence was being narrowed with it. She had not been named as the target, yet she felt the edge of the blade. Anne tightened her fingers around her glasses as the trustees continued. She loved her brother, and that love made the moment crueler, not softer. But she had also served the late queen with a discipline that did not bend easily. The monarch's final wishes were not a memory to be negotiated. They were a duty. Anne knew Charles was hurting, yet she also knew why their mother had written those safeguards. Her loyalty was being split in public silence, and every word from the trustees pulled the wound wider. Edward's name appeared next, and the room shifted again. His inclusion proved the codicil was not a symbolic warning or a private emotional note. It was a working structure, designed to involve more than one branch of the family when the crown's continuity was at risk. A trustee explained that the phrase meant the long-term stability of the monarchy, the careful line between personal choice and public duty. But when he said the codicil would activate whenever royal decisions risked damaging that continuity, the words landed like an accusation aimed straight at Charles. Charles finally lifted his head. His voice was low, but the pain inside it cut through the room. He asked who had advised the Queen to include such language, and for the first time, the trustees did not answer quickly. William looked down. Camilla turned toward the king. Anne became completely still. Everyone knew the answer would not begin with a document. It would begin with a moment, and that question pulled the family back to the incident that had quietly set this entire reckoning in motion. Every royal rupture has a moment no one forgets, even if no one dares mention it. For this family, it was not a balcony appearance, not a public interview, not a ceremony watched by millions. It was a private Windsor dinner, where one chair remained empty too long, one remark cut too deep, and Queen Elizabeth made a decision she never reversed. Charles remembered that dinner now, because the silence around the trustees' table had the same cold weight. The Windsor Legacy dinner had been arranged after a tense royal review meeting, a private gathering meant to calm nerves and restore order, before the next reign became more than a distant idea. It mattered, because that evening was supposed to prove the family could still speak honestly behind closed doors. Instead, it became the moment when private ambition brushed against royal duty, and the Queen saw a danger she could not ignore. Charles had arrived at that dinner, convinced he was asking for practical authority, not personal advantage. He wanted a future restructuring plan approved, one that would give him wider control over household appointments, estate access, and the inner order of palace life. To him, it was about efficiency. To the Queen, it sounded like pressure building around the crown before the crown had even passed. She listened without interrupting, but William watched his grandmother's expression tighten when the conversation turned toward Camilla's influence. The prince saw what others tried not to see. The monarch was not only hearing a proposal, she was measuring the people who might shape it. Camilla did not raise her voice that night. That made her words more dangerous. She spoke softly about old restrictions, and suggested that some of them should end with the next reign. The Queen set down her spoon before dessert, and the sound cut through the room like a warning. Anne understood it instantly. She challenged the plan, telling Charles that monarchy cannot survive if private preference begins to look like public entitlement. Her brother felt exposed, almost corrected in front of the family he hoped would support him. The king-to-be saw Anne's loyalty as resistance, while she saw her warning as service. Queen Elizabeth left the table before the final course. No dramatic farewell, no raised voice, just a decision moving silently beneath the surface. Later that night, she summoned 2 trustees and gave instructions for a protective codicil to be drafted. A codicil, an added legal direction attached to an existing royal document, would preserve institutional continuity after her death. That phrase meant the crown's long-term stability, the careful protection of monarchy from emotional choices, family pressure, and private influence. Charles now understood the cruelty of memory. Years later, the words born from that dinner were being read back to him in the same castle where the rupture began. But memory alone could not contain the anger rising inside Charles when he turned toward the one person he believed had known too much. When Charles asked everyone except William to leave, the room understood the command before it was spoken twice. Chairs shifted. The trustees gathered their papers. Camilla hesitated near the door, but Anne's look told her this conversation could not be softened. Father and son were left alone, under the weight of a dead queen's signature, and neither man knew how to begin without breaking something. Charles waited until the door closed before he spoke. The smaller adjoining room offered no comfort, only distance from the people who had watched him bleed in silence. He demanded to know when William first learned of the codicil, and the word itself seemed to darken the air between them. A codicil is an added instruction attached to a larger legal document, and this one had become more than paper. It had become proof that Queen Elizabeth had placed safeguards around decisions Charles believed would one day belong to him alone. That mattered because the monarchy does not only move through crowns and ceremonies, it moves through access, inheritance, household power, and the quiet authority to decide who stands closest to the throne. William did not answer quickly. The prince knew any careless word could turn pain into war. He admitted he had known the queen created safeguards before her death, but he insisted he had not known the exact wording until the trustees read it aloud. Charles heard the answer and still felt betrayed. Not because William had written the line, not because the future king had forced the queen's hand. The wound came from something more personal. His own son had lived beside the possibility of this restriction, and had not warned him. The king had walked into the room unguarded, and William had allowed him to be struck by the truth in front of everyone. Charles pressed harder, his voice controlled but wounded. He asked whether William understood what those safeguards implied. The prince said the queen wanted continuity protected. Continuity meant the survival of the crown beyond one reign, beyond one marriage, beyond one moment of emotion. But Charles heard accusation inside the word. He heard doubt. He heard his mother's final judgment arriving through his son's careful tone. For a monarch who had waited decades to prove himself, it felt like his reign had been measured before it had fully begun. William then revealed the line Charles feared most. The codicil gave the future king a consultative vote in decisions affecting long-term royal legacy. Charles struck the table with his palm. The sound broke the restraint both men had been clinging to. William did not flinch. He said he would not apologize for respecting the Queen's final instructions, even if those instructions hurt the king. That refusal opened the sharpest father-son divide since the succession passed. Charles returned to the main chamber with a pale face and a silence no one dared challenge. Camilla searched his expression. Anne lowered her eyes, and William followed a few steps behind, steady, but marked by the confrontation. Yet the room had not finished with them. The trustees were waiting, and the real power now sat in their hands. And what they revealed next proved this was not merely a family wound, but a machinery of control, built with terrifying precision. The trustees did not raise their voices because they did not need to. Their power was written in ink, witnessed in silence, and protected by the one name no living royal could overrule. Charles listened as the machinery unfolded piece by piece. Every clause sounded polite. Every sentence looked formal. Yet beneath the legal calm was a message sharp enough to wound a king. Charles returned to his seat, knowing the room had changed while he was gone. His confrontation with William had not weakened the codicil. It had only made its force clearer. The senior trustee began again, explaining that the late Queen's instruction created a Royal Continuity Council, a private family and legal body designed to review decisions that could affect the monarchy's future stability. That mattered, because this council would not deal with ordinary palace routine. It would handle the sensitive things no public speech ever names directly: key estates, historic titles, ceremonial privileges, and private royal archives. These were not decorations around the throne. They were the hidden levers of royal legacy. William sat with a stillness that Charles could not ignore. The prince's place inside the council meant the future king now had a formal voice in matters once assumed to belong to his father's personal reign. Anne's name followed, then Edward's, then the trustees themselves, along with one rotating legal guardian appointed to protect the Queen's private directives. A private directive meant a confidential instruction left by the monarch to guide royal decisions after her death. It sounded simple. It was anything but simple. Each name made the structure stronger, and each role made Charles feel more surrounded. Charles felt reduced in a way no public ceremony could repair. Outside that chamber, he remained the king. Crowds would still bow. Papers would still carry his title. Palace statements would still speak in his name. But inside the room where power actually moved, his judgment had been narrowed by the mother whose approval he had spent a lifetime chasing. He did not lose the crown. He lost the comfort of believing that the crown trusted him completely. The senior trustee lowered his eyes before giving the hardest explanation. The codicil had been designed to protect the crown from emotional decision-making. The words did not shout, yet they struck with brutal force. Charles heard a warning about himself. Camilla heard a warning about her. William heard the burden of what he might one day inherit. Anne heard duty calling her forward, whether it broke her brother's heart or not. Edward, quiet but visibly shaken, understood that his name in the document meant neutrality was no longer possible. Camilla absorbed the next revelation without moving. She could not vote. She could not advise formally. She could not request access through Charles on any matter governed by the codicil. The queen consort had influence beside the king, but not inside this structure. That distinction mattered, because influence without recognition becomes fragile the moment rules are written down. Anne's silence became louder than any objection. Her name stood as one of the guardians expected to enforce the late queen's wishes whenever conflict arose. Charles looked from the trustees to Anne, then to William, and finally to Camilla. No one had raised a sword. No one had seized a throne. But something had been taken all the same. Camilla kept her face steady, yet the stillness around her had changed into pain. She understood that when the meeting ended, the wound would follow her beyond the chamber. Because the moment the chamber doors opened, the codicil stopped being a document and became a new reality everyone had to live inside. The first consequence was not announced by trumpet, bulletin, or palace statement. It happened in a corridor, with one aide stopping another before a file could be carried through a private door. That was when everyone understood the codicil had teeth. The monarchy had not collapsed. It had shifted quietly, and those closest to power felt the floor move first. Charles felt the change before anyone explained it to him. The meeting had ended, the chamber doors had opened, and still the words followed him like a shadow. A scheduled review of estate access and ceremonial appointments was paused within the hour, and that pause mattered, because these were not small diary adjustments. Estate access decided who could enter the private royal spaces that carried history and influence. Ceremonial appointments shaped who stood beside the crown at moments when the world was watching. The king had expected those matters to come directly to him. Now they had to pass through a new wall. Palace staff moved carefully, as though one wrong phrase might expose how much had changed. Revised instructions began spreading through private offices, telling aides that certain files could no longer go straight to Charles' personal desk. They had to be reviewed by the trustees first. That single change wounded him deeply because the personal office had always been where royal authority felt most real. Public speeches could be polished, ceremonies could be rehearsed, but the private file placed before the monarch was the quiet proof that decisions still began with him. Now even that proof had been interrupted. Camilla absorbed her own punishment in silence. She retreated to a private sitting room, removed her gloves slowly, and sat alone with the truth she could no longer avoid. The queen consort had not been shouted down. She had not been publicly embarrassed. Something colder had happened. Her influence had been formally contained. Every request, every suggestion, every quiet movement through Charles's authority would now meet rules she could not charm, soften, or bypass. The pain was not only personal, it was strategic. She understood that power does not always vanish with a public blow. Sometimes it disappears when a door no longer opens. Charles refused lunch. He remained in his study with the Codicil open before him, devastated by the feeling that his mother's final hand still directed the room. Queen Elizabeth was gone, yet her authority had not left Windsor. That was what made the wound so hard to bear. The king had waited his whole life to rule, but the late monarch had reached beyond death to shape the limits of his reign. Then the next proof arrived. A planned adjustment to royal household roles was suspended before it could become public, showing that the Codicil could stop decisions before the world even knew they existed. William received a brief note from the trustees, requesting his presence at the first continuity review, and the prince understood at once that his new role had begun. He was no longer waiting outside the machinery, he was inside it. Anne changed the emotional temperature with one quiet request. She asked William to meet her privately before the review, away from Charles, Camilla, and every official witness. The prince knew that meeting would not be about procedure. It would be about loyalty, restraint, and the terrible cost of carrying power without turning it into revenge. And in that quiet meeting, the story moved from shock toward a choice that would define the future of the family. Anne did not summon William like a prince. She spoke to him like a nephew standing too close to history. No aides waited outside. No trustees sat between them. Only two chairs, one low fire, and a silence heavy with the Queen's absence. In that room, the Codicil became something more than control. It became a test of whether power could be carried without cruelty. William entered carrying more than a note from the trustees. He carried the weight of a role that had arrived before he was ready to hold it. Anne understood that before he said a word. She did not offer comfort first. She offered warning. The Codicil had given him a consultative vote, meaning a formal voice in decisions where his opinion could shape the outcome without making him the sole authority. That mattered, because influence inside a royal structure is never harmless. One careful vote could protect the crown. One careless choice could break a father, divide a family, and turn duty into punishment. Anne made the boundary clear. The Codicil must not become a weapon against Charles. She knew her brother was wounded, and William knew it too. The prince admitted that seeing his father devastated by the Queen's final decision had hurt more than he expected. Charles had spent decades waiting for the crown, waiting for the chance to prove his vision had purpose. Now the same inheritance that gave him power had arrived with limits written by the mother he revered. William did not excuse every choice around his father, but sorrow moved through him anyway, sharp and honest. Anne softened only when the truth became too heavy to carry coldly. She told William that loyalty sometimes means enforcing a boundary someone you love will never forgive. The words struck him because they sounded like the Queen speaking through her daughter. Anne then revealed what had been buried beneath the legal calm. The late monarch had not feared Charles in the simple way people might imagine. She feared the pressure surrounding him. She feared the voices that might use his reign to settle old grievances, reopen closed doors, and turn private disappointment into royal policy. William understood then that the Codicil was not revenge, it was protection. It protected Charles from being pulled too far by emotion. It protected the crown from becoming a battlefield for old wounds. It protected the future from decisions made in pain. That realization changed the prince's posture, not with triumph, but with resolve. He would support the Codicil. He would take his seat at the continuity review. But he would not humiliate his father before the country, before the household, or before history. Anne accepted that decision without praise, because praise would have made the moment smaller. She simply looked at him as if measuring whether he had understood the cost. William had. Power had come to him early, but cruelty would not come with it. That decision prepared the palace response. But outside Windsor, the world was about to discover that something historic had happened. And when the first public image of the crisis broke, the private wound became a national reckoning. By morning, Britain did not know every clause, but it knew enough to feel the ground shift. The palace walls had held the words, yet the mood had escaped. One photograph, one headline, one broadcaster's grave opening sentence turned a private codicil into a public symbol. The country saw a king still crowned, yet suddenly surrounded by invisible limits. Charles woke to a nation already interpreting his silence. The palace had released a controlled statement before dawn, confirming that royal trustees had reviewed continuity provisions connected to the late Queen's private instructions. Continuity provisions meant protective rules designed to keep the monarchy stable during moments of family pressure, private disagreement, or future transition. The wording was careful, almost cold. It did not mention humiliation. It did not mention Camilla. It did not say the king's private authority had been narrowed. But the public understood the shape of the truth anyway. Something serious had happened behind Windsor walls, and the careful language only made it feel more explosive. Charles watched the morning coverage alone, his jaw tight, as commentators spoke about the Queen's enduring influence over his reign. Each sentence pressed against the same wound. He was monarch, yet his mother's final will still seemed to stand behind him, guiding decisions he had believed would finally be his. That mattered, because public authority depends on confidence, and confidence depends on the belief that the king is not being quietly managed by a structure hidden from view. He did not fear the crowd. He feared the meaning they might attach to his stillness. Camilla could not bear the discussion for long. A panel suggested the codicil reflected distrust of her circle, and she turned off the broadcast before the sentence could fully settle. The queen consort left without speaking, but her silence carried more pain than any denial. She had survived years of judgment, distance, and suspicion, only to discover that the late monarch's final safeguards had given old doubts a new life. Her private influence had become a public question, and that question cut through every careful step she had taken toward acceptance. The vivid moment came with the front page of the London Herald. Windsor Castle filled the cover beneath the headline, "The Queen's Final Limit." The phrase spread quickly, because it captured what people felt but could not fully explain. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd gathered near the gates. They were not shouting. They were staring at the balcony, as if waiting for history to explain itself. That silence mattered. It was not rebellion. It was recognition. The monarchy had changed without asking the nation to watch, yet the nation had felt the change anyway. William saw the coverage and understood the danger Anne had warned him about. If the codicil became a weapon, Charles would be weakened beyond repair. If it became a shield, the crown might survive the pain. Anne knew the same truth, and Camilla felt the cost of it in every headline. The public storm forced Charles toward the hardest choice of his reign: resist the codicil emotionally, or accept it as the last command of the Queen he never stopped serving. And in the final reckoning, Charles's silence became the answer the monarchy needed. The end did not come with surrender. It came with stillness. Charles stood before the same folder that had wounded him, reading the final page not as a son rejected, but as a king confronted with the truth of monarchy itself. The codicil had taken something from him, but it also gave him one last chance to prove he could serve something larger than his pride. Charles did not speak quickly, and that silence carried more power than any protest could have done. The Royal Continuity Council would begin its work, and he would not challenge it. That council meant a private group of trustees and senior family members, created to review sensitive royal decisions before they could damage the monarchy's future. The Codicil, an added legal instruction attached to the late Queen's private papers, had become the boundary he could no longer avoid. It mattered, because rejecting it would have turned a family wound into a palace crisis. Accepting it preserved stability, even while admitting that Queen Elizabeth's safeguards would shape his reign behind closed doors. Charles felt the humiliation slowly change into something heavier and strangely quieter. Grief remained, pain remained. But beneath both sat recognition. The Queen had not written the Codicil to destroy him. She had written it to protect the crown, the ancient burden of monarchy that belongs to the institution before it belongs to any person. The king understood that now, and the understanding hurt because it demanded maturity from the very place where he felt most wounded. He had wanted freedom. His mother had left him duty. William approached him privately after the formal acceptance, and neither man rushed toward comfort. The prince had already chosen restraint over triumph, and Charles could feel that choice in the careful way his son stood before him. For a moment, father and heir were not fighting over power. They were standing beneath the same burden. Charles looked at William and said, "Then we carry it properly." The words were restrained, but they mattered. They did not erase betrayal. They did not heal every wound, but they gave both men a way forward without tearing the family apart. And Camilla remained wounded by the restriction, and Charles knew it. The Queen Consort understood that he would not overturn the Queen's final will simply to ease her pain. That truth cut deeply, yet it also marked the moment she realized the decision was bigger than her place beside him. Anne signed the first continuity review paper without triumph, and her restraint proved what the Codicil had always meant. It was not victory, it was duty. The Codicil reshaped Charles's future reign by reminding everyone that the crown is not personal property, not family revenge, and not private inheritance. It is a burden passed through generations, and even a king must bow before the duty that made him king. The monarchy survived because Charles finally accepted the hardest truth of his reign. The Queen was gone, but her command still guarded the crown. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.